Everyone mistakenly thinks that Hamas like controls Palestine. That's not true at all. There's 3 different areas that were drawn up with the original partition. It's the West Bank, which is totally under military rule by Israel, and then there's the Gaza Strip, which is like the open air prison, which they bomb the shit out of like every couple of years, and Hamas controls that area. And then there's Jerusalem, which is an international city center that both Arabs and Jews live in. But the West Bank has been occupied militarily since 1967, and it's complete martial law. There's checkpoints. All political parties are illegal. Having a gun is like the least of it. You can't hold a flag. You can't belong to a political party. You literally can't do shit if you're a Palestinian. You just have to sit there and submit. Even if you share a photo of someone who was like killed by an Israeli soldier, you go to jail. And you go to jail for the amount of like months that...
What?
Yeah. Based on the shares and likes of the photo, they'll penalize you more and put you in prison for longer and longer. It is absolutely insane. We went to... The first day that we were there, we went to a funeral of some guy, some farmer who was shot by Israeli forces. And we went to the funeral. It was horrible. You know, all the women are wailing and crying. And as we're leaving, the Israeli forces had set up a checkpoint right outside of this dude's house and started tear gassing and shooting rubber bullets like at people who were simply attending the funeral, just to punish people for attending the funeral. We went to another girl's house named Aya, who got shot in the vagina for peacefully protesting at some protest, and they shot 200 people that day. One guy next to her died, another guy was paralyzed. They have a policy called shoot to cripple, where they shoot guys in the dicks. Yeah. It is fucking nuts, man. The West Bank is no joke. I thought that I was going to die several times. And the person who was driving us had just told us that a couple months prior to that, some woman, Palestinian woman, because you can't go to Jerusalem. Like, if you're Palestinian, there's like barely any Palestinians who are even allowed to go pray at the most holy site, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. You can't go to the beach. You're just completely constricted in a prison, and you can't travel. And he was just telling us that months before we went through this checkpoint, someone was going through the checkpoint because they got a permit to go into Jerusalem, which is like a lifetime golden ticket, like Willy Wonka. And they're walking and she just got executed. And then...
What?
Yeah, she just got executed, and she was bleeding out at this checkpoint, and her little brother tried to help her, and they shot him too. And they're like hiding the video of this.
Why
and this is
they
just a
shoot
day
her?
because they fucking hate Palestinians, and Palestinians are animals to these people. It's sick, man. It's sick. You have to be to maintain this Jewish supremacist state. You have to be like more fascist and more controlling and more militaristic in the way that you rule society, just like the U.S. I mean, people who were considered outlier fringe assholes 30 years ago are now like the Christian evangelicals are now in power. It's really, really crazy. I mean, it's not the same because Israel is a white nationalist, like ethno-supremacist state. And you see the way that they treat Ethiopians and African refugees, and it becomes obvious that even if you're a Jew and you're black, you still are a second-class citizen there.
When you're saying occupation, you mean occupation of Palestine or occupation of Israel itself, the West Bank?
So the West Bank has been militarily occupied since 1967. So when Israel was created in 1948, there were those 3 partitioned areas that I talked about. And ever since that happened, Israel has just continued to take over more and more land in the West Bank. So these settlements just keep growing and growing and growing and growing. Over time, there was like mass resistances that happened. And then in 1967, Israel was like, we're just going to do a large-scale invasion and try to take over all the land. And then they just stayed and occupied this area. And they just have been there ever since. And so that's like the huge international crime. When the international community is like, by the way, these settlements are illegal and we're like condemning you at the UN. And the U.S. just vetoes it every time. Because the U.S. is just like boys with Israel unconditionally. It's sick, man. And they just signed that $10 billion aid package. Giving it to Israel for the next 10 years is... Actually, I think it was $30 billion over the next 10 years, which is crazy because this would never be able to happen if it weren't just completely supported by the U.S.
And why is it supported by the U.S.?
I don't know. I think that the U.S. loves using Israel as a military garrison. They love using that strategic point in the Middle East to have. But honestly, it's becoming so unpopular. Obama had a big feud with Netanyahu. I mean, Trump is disgusting because Jared Kushner is personally invested in illegal settlements, and he like is boys with Netanyahu.
Invested financially?
Yeah, the Kushner Foundation, like his family's actual foundation, has funded illegal settlements. But if you fund some charity in Gaza, you will go to jail for supporting terrorism. But you can go fund illegal settlements and sponsor settlers to go and live on top of Arab villages, and that's fine. I guess that's freedom.
Do you think that most people just aren't aware?
Yes. I didn't even know. I had no idea how crazy it was.
And you've been pretty vocally pro-Palestinian for a while. I remember you had a piece that you were criticized about on your show where you were furious about...
Oh my God, yeah. And people are just, it's so confusing and convoluted on purpose because it really relies on Israel being the victim and for people not really understanding that Palestinians are not all terrorists and that it's really just a case of being occupied. But a lot of these
Israelis want? They just want to push the Palestinians completely out? And where do they want them to go?
They want them, they don't care as long as they're gone. As long as they're gone.